I have always found that Oxford breathes differently at night. The city, all stone and spire, sheds its daily voices and settles into something closer to confession than silence. I would walk then, half for the company of my own thoughts and half for the possibility that the stones might yield some truth I had missed in daylight. Rain had fallen earlier, a light drizzle, just enough to darken the cobbles of Broad Street and lay a sheen across the carved steps of Balliol's entrance. My shoes tapped against them as if to remind me that I hadn't gone home when I should. It was not unusual. Solitude and insomnia have been steady companions, and sometimes a case already half forming in the back of my mind will insist upon its right to be rehearsed against the darker canvas of night. But on that particular evening, the quiet felt unusually heavy, as though the city itself wished to warn me of something, though without words. The bells had chimed 9. A pedestrian here, another there, a student hunched in scarf and gown, a don carried away by his own mutterings. Their presences made no dent in the stillness. One cannot help, in such hours, recalling the paradox that this same city, with its quadrangles and libraries, is never far from death. Knowledge lives longer than bodies, and I, who was supposed to care about the former, could never quite shake the pursuit of the latter. The case began, though I did not yet know it, with a faint impression on stone. There is a ledge just outside Exeter, worn and uneven, where rainwater always pools. That night my eye, inattentive though it wished to be, caught the oddest disturbance, the smear of a shoe print, dragged slightly as though the wearer had halted or stumbled. It was no great thing, nothing that another would notice, but it lingered in me like the first bar of a tune one cannot later dislodge. I paused, leaned down, and let my fingers trace the damp outline, not fresh, but not old either. A man, I judged. Narrow, yet the heel pressed with weight. A hesitation there is not quite the neat placement of a hurrying scholar, more akin to someone reconsidering his path or shifting under a burden unseen. These are trifles, of course. I have lived long enough to know that trifles compose the score, while others only hear the melody. I lit a cigarette and allowed the smoke to curl upward, carrying with it the sense that the night had already placed me on the edge of something. Not a crime yet, merely the whisper of one. When I finally turned back towards St. Giles, the city revealed another detail. A light in one of the upper rooms of Exeter flickered, dimmed, and was extinguished. Again, nothing extraordinary. Students read late and fall asleep with lamps unguarded. Yet the pattern of its dying, the slight quiver before the dark, unsettled me, as though the light had not been switched, but snuffed. I carried these fragments with me to Randolph, where a whisky might reconcile them into nothing. Lewis had gone home, content with his pint, his patience worn by my endless revisions of our earlier interview with a rather tedious lecturer who claimed not to have seen anyone loitering by the Bodleian Arch. I, too, had grown weary of my own suspicions, and yet I could not quite lay them down. At the bar, I scribbled on the back of a crossword torn from the Times. I find such diversions more useful than they first appear. The clue, as it happened, was 10 letters lingering sound of retreat. I reverberated, then crossed it out. Later, I returned to it, considering the aftershock. Neither fit perfectly, and yet both words held some subtle echo of what I had felt in the streets outside, the residue of an act already past, vibrating faintly in the air. It amused me that the crossword, in its oblique way, was already rehearsing the shape of things to come. I did not solve it then. I let the answer rest uncertain, as I so often do with people. One must learn to endure ambiguity, even befriend it. The whisky was half gone when a porter from Exeter appeared, awkward in his approach. He knew me by sight. Oxford has a way of carrying whispers even quicker than the river. He leaned against the counter, asked whether I might be available tomorrow morning. A death had been discovered, sudden, in one of the college rooms. A visiting scholar, nothing sensational, but the college would prefer discretion. I remember that my glass tilted in my hand and the amber surface shifted like an unsteady horizon. I asked him the time of death, though I knew such questions are usually premature. He said only that the man had not appeared at hall, and when the room was unlocked, silence was found. That phrase stayed with me until silence was found. An odd way to describe the absence of breath. I agreed, naturally, though my agreement carried less resolve than resignation. These things fall to us not because we invite them, but because they cling. I thought of the shoe print again, the hesitant press on wet stone. I thought of the light that had flickered, extinguished, too slowly. The city had been whispering, and now the whisper was given a name. I walked home by way of the Sheldonian, whose domed roof gleamed under a rising moon. The air had cleared, leaving behind the sharp scent of wet earth. Passing the Radcliffe camera, I could not resist touching the cool stone, as if the building itself might offer some reassurance. It gave none. Later, alone in my flat, I laid the crossword on the table and stared again at the clue. Lingering sound of retreat. My pencil hovered, and before I could resist, I wrote echo. Only 4 letters, far too short, yet it seemed to fit better than any elaborate invention. Echo, the faint return of what has already gone. That was what I had heard in the streets of Oxford, what I felt still in the marrow of the night. And so, with that unfinished puzzle before me, I switched off the light. The quiet of stone had deepened, enclosing me, as it has always done, both shield and accusation. Somewhere in the college rooms, a man had ceased to breathe, and tomorrow the city would demand its due. The morning announced itself with a sky the colour of pewter, the sort of grey that seems less a background than a verdict. I had not slept well, though that in itself was hardly remarkable. My flat still carried the faint smoke of last night's cigarettes, and on the table the unfinished crossword lay like an accusation waiting for a mind fresher than mine. I stared at the clue again, the lingering sound of retreat, and found that even now I resisted the answer. Echo was correct in spirit but wrong in measure. I left it as it was, an incomplete truth, and poured myself black coffee to ward off the hour. Lewis arrived with his usual mixture of irritation and loyalty. He remarked that I looked worse than the weather, and I told him that the city often dictated my complexion. He did not laugh, but he rarely does. We walked together under that brooding canopy, our shoes clipping on the wet flagstones, and I noticed that he carried the day's paper tucked under his arm. He offered it to me, but I declined. Too often I prefer the silence of ignorance to the clamour of headlines. At Exeter, the porter who had found me at the Randolph waited at the gate. His face bore that curious expression Oxford porters often wear, dignity shadowed by servitude, pride concealed beneath routine. He nodded, lowered his voice, and said the body was still in situ, as though the word itself could soften the reality. A visiting scholar, a man by the name of Dr. Adrian Lonsdale. Classics, though more antiquarian than academic, which in Oxford can mean many things and nothing. His papers had arrived only recently. His presence was almost invisible until his absence made him known. The room was reached by a narrow staircase, the kind where every tread carries the ghosts of centuries. Lewis climbed ahead, his bulk filling the confined space, while I lingered half a step behind, listening to the creak of the boards. At the top, the door stood ajar, and the air that seeped out was faintly metallic, the unmistakable scent of a room that had lost its occupant too abruptly. Inside, Dr. Lonsdale lay upon the bed. His face had turned slightly towards the wall, as though in sleep, but the pallor of the skin betrayed the truth. The glass upon the bedside table was empty, save for the trace of some dark residue at the bottom. His notes, stacked untidily on the desk, seemed almost to lean towards him, eager to be read, unwilling to accept the silence that had overtaken their author. I looked first not at the man but at the room. The curtains were half drawn, one caught awkwardly against the frame. On the floor beside the desk lay a scattering of matches, though the box remained unopened. A trivial thing, perhaps, yet I have learned that trivialities are often the truest witnesses. Why discard matches you have never struck? Why scatter what should be neatly kept? Lewis muttered about natural causes, heart failure perhaps, or a stroke. He had seen too many bodies that bore no mark of violence, and habit inclines the mind towards the simple. But I felt the disturbance in the air, that faint aftertaste of hesitation I had noticed already the night before, in the print on the stone, in the flickering of a lamp. The city whispers in fragments, and I am condemned to listen. I asked the porter who had discovered him. He said he had knocked twice at the hour of dinner, and when no answer came, he fetched the sub-warden. Together they unlocked the door and found silence. His choice of word again. I made a note of it, though not on paper. Language betrays more than observation, and silence is never neutral. It is chosen or imposed. Lewis busied himself with practicalities, the doctor to be summoned, the coroner to be informed. I walked to the desk, leafed through the top sheet of Lonsdale's papers. Latin, naturally, but not the polished prose of a published scholar. Jottings, half-translations, the obsessive notations of a man retracing steps, long worn into the soil of history. One line caught me, hastily underlined moriendum est omnibus. All must die. It is no great discovery, yet the insistence of the underlining gave it weight beyond the commonplace. Perhaps he had sensed his own appointment with the phrase, or perhaps another had wished him to. The doctor arrived, brisk, a man whose confidence in his own judgment required no assistance from police or detective. He pronounced the time of death as late evening, though with a caution that made the pronouncement little more than ceremony. Heart failure, he suggested, natural, unavoidable. He spoke as though the body were an inconvenience to be removed so that normality could return to the college. I thanked him, though I trusted his certainty no more than the drizzle that promised but never delivered rain. When the others left us, I lingered alone by the window. The quadrangle below was empty, the grass damp with last night's rainfall. A rook landed clumsily upon the stone ledge, pecked once, and flew away. In the distance I heard the faint clang of a gate closing. The city had returned to its ordinary rhythms, but I could not join them. There was something unresolved, the echo of retreat still sounding, though faint. Lewis reappeared with the paper he had earlier offered. He unfolded it upon the desk, muttering that perhaps the scholar's death would not even merit a paragraph. As he spoke, my eye was drawn to the crossword once again, printed in its rigid grid. Another clue caught me unawares. 6 letters, means of concealment. I wrote the word curtain in my mind, then rejected it. 6 letters. Screen, perhaps? Or shroud? I glanced at the half-drawn curtain by the bed, its fabric trapped awkwardly. A shroud indeed, though careless, insufficient. I felt the faint tightening in my chest that often precedes deduction, though it was not yet fully formed. We left the room with the body still present, the porter standing guard, as though the dead required protection. Outside, the sky had deepened to a darker steel, and rain began to fall at last. I lit another cigarette, though the flame struggled against the damp wind. Lewis asked if I thought it was murder. I told him I did not know. It was the truth, though an incomplete one. I knew only that the quiet of stone had been broken, and the fragments would not rest until they had found their shape. We walked back across the quadrangle, and I could not shake the sense that the city itself had reported the death long before the porter. The shoe print, the extinguished lamp, the unfinished crossword. Each syllable in a sentence is still unread. I have never been adept at patience, and yet in Oxford one learns that answers, like echoes, arrive only when the silence is deep enough to hold them. The rain thickened, our coats glistened, and the bells began their slow announcement of the hour. I thought then not of the dead man, but of the living, and how often they conceal themselves behind curtains, too clumsily drawn. Oxford's colleges are fortresses of a kind, though they do not seem so to those who pass beneath their arches daily. To the casual visitor they are places of beauty, cloisters, lawns, libraries, but to those who must probe them, as I too often have, they are structures designed less to welcome than to contain. Within those walls, silence thickens, secrets curdle, and time itself seems to hold its breath. Exeter was no exception. Its gates closed upon us with the weight of centuries, and I felt again that peculiar mixture of privilege and imprisonment that defines this city. Lewis walked with me across the quadrangle, our coats still carrying the damp of the morning's rain. He was muttering about the bureaucracy that would follow, the reports, the statements, the tiresome necessity of convincing officials that sudden death might sometimes mean something more than nature's weary hand. I let him speak. His irritation filled the space I preferred to leave quiet, and in his words I sometimes found my own thoughts sharpened. He is my ballast, though he does not know it. The sub-warden's rooms were on the north side, overlooking the lawn that Oxford men have for centuries regarded as sacred, a space to be viewed, not trodden. We were shown in with the usual deference that is also dismissal. Yes, come in. Yes, sit down. Yes, leave quickly. The sub-warden himself, a tall man with a voice that seemed perpetually tuned to complaint, greeted us with the weariness of one who has spent his life mediating quarrels over keys and candles. He gestured to chairs, poured sherry without asking, and spoke of Dr. Adrian Lonsdale with that distant civility academics employ when truth is inconvenient. Lonsdale, he said, had been granted temporary rooms while he consulted certain manuscripts in the Bodleian. He was not, strictly speaking, a member of the college, though such distinctions matter more here than in the outside world. His manner had been courteous, if somewhat withdrawn. He kept to himself, dined irregularly, exchanged pleasantries, but no confidence. In short, the sub-warden knew nothing of him beyond his name on a list and the fact of his sudden absence from dinner. He seemed faintly irritated that death had dared to disturb the order of his college. I let him talk. People reveal most when they imagine they are saying little. He emphasized Lonsdale's solitude, his lack of connection, his invisibility. Yet solitude leaves traces. Books borrowed, letters sent, footsteps heard at odd hours. I asked whether Lonsdale received visitors. The sub-warden frowned, considered, and said he could not be certain. He thought perhaps he had once seen a figure leaving late in the evening, but he could not recall the face, nor even be sure it had been from Lonsdale's room. Ambiguity wrapped in courtesy, the Oxford gift. Lewis pressed him with practical questions, times, dates, the porter's duties. The sub-warden answered with vagueness polished into formality. I withdrew instead to the shelves that lined the room, filled with volumes that bore the dust of long neglect. One spine caught my attention. A slim book, its title barely legible, concerning the epigrams of Marshall. I lifted it, turned its pages. Between two leaves lay a slip of paper, blank on one side, on the other a hastily scrawled note in an untidy hand. Silence keeps the truth at bay. I slipped it back where I found it, uncertain whether it belonged to Lonsdale or merely to the endless detritus of academic lives. Yet it stayed with me. When we left, Lewis remarked that I had said little. I told him that listening is often more profitable than questioning. He shook his head, muttered something about riddles, and lit a cigarette. We crossed the quadrangle once more, and I found my eye returning to the windows above, curtains half drawn, as though all the college wished to look out but not be seen. It struck me then how much effort goes into concealment here, how walls do not merely keep out, but also lock in. We paused at the chapel. Its doors stood open, and I entered without comment. Lewis followed reluctantly, never comfortable with the scent of wax and stone. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the faint perfume of yesterday's flowers. I sat in a pew, let my eyes rest upon the stained glass, where saints looked down with that serene disinterest peculiar to glass. A student practiced the organ, hesitant notes drifting like questions. I thought again of the clue I had abandoned on my own crossword lingering sound of retreat. An echo, yes, but also a resonance. Perhaps the organist himself was teaching me notes linger, even when struck clumsily, their retreat never absolute. Lonsdale's death, too, would leave such a resonance. The challenge was not to mistake it for silence. Lewis grew restless, and we left. Outside the rain had stopped, but the stones still gleamed. I noticed another detail I had overlooked in the quadrangle earlier. Along the gutter by the cloister wall, a scattering of ash, finer than what a casual cigarette would produce. I crouched, touched it. Damp, easily dispersed. Yet there was too much for chance. A sheaf of papers burned in haste, perhaps reduced to nothing in the night air. Lewis asked what I had found. I told him it was nothing. Better to keep such fragments until they form a pattern. We took our leave of the college, the porter nodding us out with relief. Beyond the gates, the city resumed its ordinary pulse, car horns, footsteps, the distant cry of a vendor in Cornmarket. Yet I carried with me the peculiar weight that colleges always leave upon me. Walls do not only shield, they suffocate, they accumulate, they whisper. Back at my flat I poured another whiskey, though it was barely noon. On the table the crossword remained. I turned to it once more, not to solve, but to test the patience of ambiguity. Another clue caught my eye. 5 letters to confine. I wrote walls. It fits too easily. I erased it, then tried the cage. That fits as well. Words, like lives, resist singular definition. Perhaps that was the lesson Oxford had been pressing upon me since dawn. I sat there a long time, staring at the word cage until the letters blurred. The college, the quadrangle, the curtained windows all seemed variations on the same theme. Lonsdale had lived within those walls briefly, and now he lay within another confinement altogether. The difference was only of degree. I felt then the faint chill of recognition, as if the city itself were reminding me of my own cage, invisible but firm. And so I recorded these thoughts late into the night, while the rain resumed its quiet tapping against the window. The college within walls had revealed nothing certain, yet it had offered fragments, a scattered ash, a half-remembered visitor, a note hidden in a book, pieces of a puzzle whose picture I could not yet discern. But puzzles have always been my companions, and silence, in its way, speaks more loudly than words. It is a curious occupation, to sit in rooms where grief has only just arrived and watch how it chooses to present itself. Some are undone, unable to assemble words from the wreckage. Others take refuge in performance, their sorrow carefully attired for public scrutiny. And then there are those who seem to suffer most in silence, leaving the observer to wonder whether it is silence born of depth or silence born of distance. When I met the widow of Dr. Adrian Lonsdale, I was still undecided. The Dean had arranged our meeting in one of the panelled rooms of Exeter, where oil portraits of forgotten benefactors look down with that imperious assurance only paint can sustain. Rain pattered faintly against the diamond-paned windows, and the rooms smelled of wax and dust, as if time itself had been bottled and stored here. Lewis sat beside me, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees, while across from us the widow, Mrs. Lonsdale, composed herself with a dignity that was almost theatrical. She was younger than I had expected, not young, but younger than the image I had assembled from fragments, the scholarly husband, the solitary life, the abrupt death. Her hair was dark, streaked faintly with grey, and her eyes carried a steady calm that seemed to repel intrusion. She did not weep, nor did she smile. She simply regarded us as one might regard a jury, waiting to hear what verdict they would pronounce. The Dean presided, as deans do, his hands folded neatly upon the polished table. He spoke with the solemnity of office, rehearsing the facts in a voice that was both grave and self-important. Dr. Lonsdale, a man of learning, had passed away within the college walls. The college extended its sympathy, its resources, its regret. His words were impeccable, and yet they sounded to me like the recital of a prayer long since emptied of faith, ritual masquerading as comfort. I asked the widow if her husband had suffered any illness. She replied softly that he had not, at least none that he had shared with her. He had been vigorous, absorbed in his work, determined to complete certain researches that had long preoccupied him. He had spoken, she said, of manuscripts in the Bodleian that might alter his understanding of some obscure Latin poet. She did not pretend to follow his obsessions. She had learned only that to interrupt them was to risk being ignored. Her composure was remarkable. Lewis, who is often suspicious of calm where storms should reign, asked if she had been surprised by his sudden death. She answered that she had been surprised by nothing her husband did, whether in life or in leaving it, a curious phrase. It lingered with me, as phrases do. To be surprised by nothing is to expect everything or to expect nothing. Either way, it suggests a life lived at a distance. The Dean cleared his throat, as though to draw the air back towards him. He spoke of arrangements, of burial, of college responsibilities. I half listened, but my eyes had strayed to the mantelpiece where a small brass clock ticked faintly. The minute hand wavered between divisions, unable to decide its place. I thought then of my own crossword, from the morning 5 letters, to confine. I had written cage, but another word occurred to me now. Time itself confines us more than walls. Perhaps Lonsdale had discovered that too late. When the formalities ended, I asked if Mrs. Lonsdale might permit me a few questions alone. The Dean, visibly reluctant, withdrew, leaving us with the portraits and the rain. She turned towards me then, her gaze steady. I asked whether her husband had enemies. She did not laugh, but her lips curved faintly, as though the idea were both absurd and inevitable. Scholars, she said, accumulate resentments as others accumulate debts. He had argued, published, withdrawn, offended, reconciled, offended again. But enemies? If so, they wore the mask of colleagues. I studied her hands. They lay folded in her lap, motionless, save for one finger that traced lightly against her ring, not absent-mindedly, but with the insistence of habit. A widow already rehearsing her solitude, or a woman rehearsing something else. I asked whether she had visited him during his stay in Oxford. Only once, she said. He had written to her about the manuscripts, about the difficulty of copying, about his exhaustion. She had thought him dramatic. He had always been dramatic. Her voice faltered for the first time then, not with grief, but with irritation. Perhaps irritation was their true intimacy. Lewis shifted uneasily. He is never comfortable with the intimacies of others, even when offered reluctantly. I pressed once more, asking if her husband had seemed fearful. She paused, and in that pause I heard more than her words would admit. Then she said no, he was not a man to fear anything, except, she added almost inaudibly, the truth. I wanted to ask her what truth she meant, but the Dean returned, and the moment collapsed like a candle, suddenly snuffed. We left them then, the Dean satisfied with his own solemnity, the widow wrapped once more in her composure. Outside the rain had eased, leaving the stones of the quadrangle shining darkly. Students hurried past, their gowns fluttering like ravens' wings. Lewis muttered that the woman was too calm, that something did not ring true. I agreed, though not in his sense. Calm can be armor as well as indifference. I thought of her tracing finger, the faint curve of her lips at the mention of enemies, the remark about truth. Fragments again, waiting for a pattern. As we walked, I noticed a poster affixed to the gate of a concert to be held in the chapel, music by Tallis and Bird. The phrase printed beneath caught my eye, in manus tuas, Domine, into thy hands, O Lord. Another clue, perhaps, though to what puzzle I could not yet say. Words, like ashes, linger in the air long after their fire has burned. Back in my room, I poured the inevitable whiskey and unfolded the crossword once more. A clue I had neglected now pressed itself upon me. 7 letters, means of defense. I wrote rampart, then erased it. Another possibility is silence. Too many letters. Still the idea persisted. Silence as defense, silence as cage, silence as clock. The widow's silence, the Dean's ritual silence, the silence of a dead scholar. Oxford was built upon silence, though it cloaks itself in words. I left the crossword unfinished, as always. Some puzzles are not meant to be solved quickly. Some require the slow erosion of time, the steady drip of detail until the shape emerges. And so I sat there, the rain returning against the glass, the taste of whiskey sharp on my tongue, the widow's calm eyes lingering in my memory. Death reported, silence defended, truth deferred. The pattern had not yet revealed itself, but it whispered still in the quiet of stone. There are evenings in Oxford when music seems less a pastime than a conspiracy. It drifts through corridors, it lingers beneath arches, it settles upon stone as though rehearsing its own permanence. That night the chapel of Exeter glowed with candlelight, and the voices within gathered into a harmony that both soothed and unsettled. I sat near the back, in the half-shadow of a pillar, listening not so much for beauty as for fracture. Harmony can conceal discord, and discord is often where truth begins. Lewis had accompanied me reluctantly, more accustomed to the reliable order of a pint than the intricate uncertainties of polyphony. He sat stiffly beside me, his eyes wandering not to the choir but to the stained glass, as though hoping the saints would release him early. I let him be. The sound itself carried me elsewhere, to a space beyond the reach of the singers where memory and suspicion conversed. The programme listed Tallis and Bird, sacred music wrought in times when belief and betrayal coexisted with alarming ease. Their notes rose now in this college chapel, centuries later, and seemed to question whether faith or doubt is the more enduring chord. I thought of Dr. Lonsdale, the scholar who had sought his own truths in manuscripts and found only silence. I thought of his widow, her composure too neat, her silences too polished. And I thought of the dean, who spoke like a man performing grief rather than feeling it. Each voice distinct, yet together they formed a choir of ambiguity. As the Kyrie unfolded, I noticed something curious in the choir stalls. A young man, tenor by placement, fidgeted with his score. His eyes strayed not to the notes, but to the audience, scanning, searching. Once they met mine, and he quickly looked away. Nothing unusual, perhaps a nervous singer unsettled by the gaze of strangers. Yet I marked the tremor in his hand as he turned the page, the faint hesitation before he joined the harmony again. Suspicion does not always arrive with a flourish. Sometimes it enters on tiptoe, disguised as an unsteady note. The dean sat several rows ahead, his posture a monument to propriety. He clasped the program tightly as though clinging to ritual. At one point he leaned towards the man beside him, whispered something, and both men looked briefly toward the widow, seated with folded hands near the front. Her face betrayed nothing, yet her stillness seemed sharpened, as if she had felt the weight of their gaze. The choir moved on to Bird's Miserere, but my thoughts lingered on that silent exchange. During the interval, Lewis muttered that he could not see what good this was doing. Music, he said, is hardly evidence. I replied that music, like evidence, depends on how one listens. He shook his head, unwilling to follow my analogy, but his muttering gave me the pause I needed. I lit a cigarette just outside the chapel door, watching the smoke mingle with the damp air. On the cobbles I noticed again the faint scatter of ash by the cloister wall, the remnants I had touched earlier that day. Rain had blurred them, yet some trace remained. Not from a cigarette, paper perhaps. Words destroyed. I thought of Lonsdale's manuscripts, his obsessive notes. Knowledge, when threatened, often seeks its own immolation. We returned for the second half. The widow had not moved. She sat as before, her eyes fixed on the choir, though I wondered if she heard the music at all. The tenor with the restless hand faltered once more, his voice dipping, then recovering. The dean's gaze lingered on him too long, and in that prolonged attention I sensed a connection not yet revealed. Was it mentorship, suspicion, or something more private? Oxford thrives on such entanglements, where professional duty and personal allegiance blur until both are indistinguishable. The final motet rose, voices entwined like branches in a winter wind. I closed my eyes, and the harmony seemed to echo the crossword clue that had troubled me for days, the lingering sound of retreat. Here it was at last, embodied. The notes rose, withdrew, and yet remained, reverberating against stone long after the singers ceased. Echo, resonance, aftershock, all inadequate, all somehow correct. I thought then of the widow's words, that he feared only the truth, and wondered whether truth, like harmony, is always composed of more than one voice. When the service ended, the congregation dispersed with hushed footsteps, as though reluctant to disturb the air still trembling with song. I remained seated until the last of them had left. Lewis, patient for once, waited beside me. Then we walked slowly out into the quadrangle, the night cold but dry, the stars obscured by clouds. The college lay quiet, save for the echo of voices retreating along the cloisters. The dean passed us, offered a curt nod, and disappeared through a side door. The widow walked alone, her steps unhurried, her posture unyielding, and the tenor lingered near the chapel door, pretending to rearrange his scores. His hand trembled again, a detail easily missed, yet I have learned to attend precisely to such minutiae. Fear manifests not in grand gestures, but in the refusal of fingers to obey. I resolved then to learn his name, his connection to Lonsdale, his reason for trembling in harmony. Back in my room later, I poured whiskey and spread the crossword before me. Another clue awaited 8 letters in tune. I tried consonants, then harmony. Both fit, yet each suggested something slightly different. Consonance is agreement, the absence of conflict. Harmony is the weaving together of difference, which applied to Lonsdale's death. Agreement, silence, concealment, or a weaving of disparate voices that together formed a darker chord. I left the answer blank. Some spaces resist being filled too early. The whiskey burned in my throat, the rain resumed its tapping at the window, and the music of the evening continued to haunt the silence. Suspicion, I thought, is itself a kind of harmony, the ear detecting where the note does not quite belong. The widow, the dean, the trembling tenor, the ash scattered in the cloister, each a voice, each incomplete. Together they promised a truth not yet sung, a truth still waiting in the quiet of stone. The next morning carried that peculiar Oxford light, neither bright nor dim, but a pallid haze that seemed to flatten the stone and make every angle indistinct. I walked slowly through it, the rhythm of my steps unsettled by the memory of the music still echoing from the chapel. Harmony dissolves quickly, but suspicion lingers like smoke in an unventilated room. I could not dismiss the image of the tenor's trembling hand, nor the widow's unmoving eyes. Both had spoken without words, and I had trained myself too long to ignore such speech. At the porter's lodge a letter was waiting, forwarded from Exeter. My name written in a hurried, angular script, the envelope slightly crumpled, as if reconsidered before being delivered. No sender's mark. I carried it unopened across the city, unwilling to unfold it in public. There are things one reads only in silence. In my room I poured coffee, though whiskey would have matched the hour of my thoughts better, and slit the paper with the deliberate caution of a man opening evidence rather than correspondence. The letter was brief, no salutation, no signature, only a few sentences, each written with the uneven pressure of someone both urgent and reluctant. He knew something. He was not alone. The truth is still here. Burn nothing, read twice. The words ended abruptly as though cut off by circumstance or fear. I laid it upon the table, staring as though the paper itself might reveal the hand that had shaped it. Twice read. I obeyed, scanning it again, hoping the repetition would reveal some hidden contour. It did not, yet the insistence of the phrase carried its own deduction. The writer assumed interception, misunderstanding, or both. A second reading implies a truth that evades the first glance, ambiguity elevated to instruction. Lewis arrived soon after, muttering about rain clouds and paperwork. I showed him the letter. He frowned, said it was probably mischief, students playing games. I told him that mischief rarely instructs one to read twice. He grunted, unconvinced, but I watched as his eyes lingered longer on the words burning nothing. He asked if it referred to the ash we had seen by the cloister. Perhaps, I said, though the ash could also be the residue of countless cigarettes ground into the damp. I did not believe it myself, but I preferred to let the possibilities remain open. We walked again to Exeter, the porter greeting us with that same mixture of deference and relief. He seemed eager for us to carry the burden of curiosity away from him. I asked if any letters had been collected from Lonsdale's rooms. None, he said, only the scattered papers we had seen. His tone suggested irritation, as though scholars' words were an untidy nuisance, cluttering the order of the college. Lewis pressed him about visitors. He admitted to seeing the widow once, briefly, and another figure whose name he did not know. A younger man, dark coat, no cap. He thought perhaps connected with the choir. His uncertainty carried the ring of truth, for Oxford porters notice everything but rarely understand it. In Lonsdale's room the bed had been stripped, the desk cleared. Only the faint impression of dust rings remained where his books had been stacked. I bent down, running a finger along the floor beneath the desk. A small scrap of paper had lodged there, overlooked by the tidying hand. I smoothed it out. Half a page of Latin verse, copied hastily, the ink blotting in places. Beside one line, a marginal note, veritas lucet, in tenebris. Truth shines in darkness. I placed the fragment carefully in my pocket. Perhaps the anonymous letter was not so far removed from the scholar's own hand after all. We sat for a time in the chapel, empty now, the air still bearing a trace of candle smoke. I told Lewis of the crossword clue that had haunted me, the lingering sound of retreat. He sighed, unimpressed, but humoured me. Echo, he said flatly. I told him that echo was too short, though in spirit it was correct. He asked what difference it made. I said only that words matter, even when incomplete. He shook his head, muttered about my obsessions, but I noticed he leaned closer to the fragment of Latin I had unfolded upon the pew. Truth shines in darkness, a puzzle within a puzzle. Leaving the chapel, I saw again the tenor, crossing the quadrangle with hurried steps, a satchel clutched too tightly at his side. His gait betrayed the same tremor I had noticed in his hands. He glanced once toward us, then away, as if caught in an indiscretion. Lewis wanted to follow. I said no, not yet. Suspicion is best when it grows in silence. Pursuit too early only scatters it into the wind. We watched him vanish into the cloisters, his figure swallowed by the stone. That evening, alone once more, I returned to the letter. Twice read. I obeyed again, slower this time, tracing each word as though it were a clue in a crossword. He knew something. He was not alone. The truth is still here. Burn nothing, read twice. Each phrase seemed simple, yet each carried more weight than grammar allowed. Who knew what truth lingered, why the command not to burn? I thought of the ash by the cloister, the residue of knowledge destroyed. And yet the writer insisted the truth remained, as though fire itself could not consume it. I poured whiskey, letting the glass rest heavy in my hand. Another clue from the crossword mocked me. 9 letters, a repeated act I tried rehearsing. I tried a recurrence, neither fit. Then I looked again at the letter, twice read, and thought of repetition as a command. Repetition is endurance, the act of seeing again. What one has already seen and discovering it is not the same. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the truth, like the music in the chapel, required not one hearing, but 2 or more, until harmony revealed its fracture. I sat long into the night, the city outside hushed beneath its veil of rain. The letter lay before me, the Latin fragment beside it, the crossword half complete. Nothing resolved, everything suggested. Oxford thrives on such ambiguities, and I unwillingly but inevitably had become its listener. A letter twice read, and still unread. Oxford teaches you early that nothing is ever quite as it seems. A window glimmers as though with firelight, but holds only the pale reflection of a passing lamp. A voice resonates in a chapel, and you would swear it belongs to God, until the register betrays the nerves of a student. And in the matter of investigation, one is constantly betrayed by echoes of things that sound like truth, but are only reverberations of another sound entirely. By the time I had reached what I would later call the turning point, I had been misled by more echoes than I care to admit. Lewis and I walked together down St. Giles that evening, the drizzle returning, the pavements shining as though polished. He was uncharacteristically silent, which is often a sign of his suspicion that I am leading him into circles. He is usually right. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl against the damp air, watching how quickly it dissipated. I remarked that smoke is the perfect red herring. It fills the room, distracts the senses, but leaves nothing behind except the suspicion that something once burned. He asked if I was speaking of the ash by the cloister. I said perhaps. In truth, I was speaking of Oxford itself. Back at Exeter, we sought the tenor again. He was leaving rehearsal, music tucked under his arm, head bent against the rain. I caught his eye, and he froze with the expression of a man rehearsing excuses. We spoke in the portico, our words half concealed by the tapping of rain on stone. He admitted to knowing Lonsdale, but only in passing. The scholar had asked him once for directions, nothing more. His hand trembled again as he spoke, though he tried to hide it by adjusting the music sheets. I wondered aloud why such a trivial acquaintance would make him afraid. He denied fear, but fear clung to his posture like damp clothes. An echo again, words saying one thing, gestures another. Lewis pressed him bluntly where he had been on the night of the death. The boy flushed, stammered, said he had been at rehearsal, then at his rooms, alone. He could not provide a witness. I watched his eyes, how they darted toward the chapel, then away. He was telling the truth, but not the truth we asked. There is a distinction, and it is in that narrow space between what is said and unsaid that cases are won or lost. We let him go, though Lewis muttered that the boy was hiding something. I agreed, though not what Lewis thought. Hiding does not always mean guilt. Sometimes it is simply the instinct of youth confronted with age and authority. Still, the tremor in his hand stayed with me, as insistent as the note that refuses to resolve in harmony. Later in my room, I unfolded the anonymous letter once more. Twice read, it instructed. I read it a third time and found that the words had been altered by repetition. He knew something. He was not alone. The truth is still here. Burn nothing. Read twice. That last command now seemed less instruction than warning. Read twice, because once is not enough. Read twice, because the first time you will mistake echo for voice. I laid the letter beside the crossword, where another clue waited. 10 letters, deliberate misdirection. I tried camouflage, illusion, and subterfuge, none fit. Then it came to me as a red herring, 10 letters exactly. I filled it in, and the puzzle advanced by 1 square. The city itself had whispered the answer. The next day I met the dean once more, his manner no less solemn, though weariness now crept into his voice. He insisted that the college must protect its reputation. Death within its walls is regrettable, but scandal is intolerable. He asked if I had formed any conclusions. I told him conclusions are like harmony, only convincing when every note aligns. He did not understand or pretended not to. He repeated his concern about gossip, about newspapers. I noticed his hand resting too heavily on the program from the concert, its edges frayed as though worried between finger and thumb. Even deans tremble, though they disguise it in dignity. I walked alone across the quadrangle after the rain had ceased, the flagstones gleaming with pale light. In the corner, near the cloister, I saw again the remnants of ash, less now, scattered, as though someone had tried to sweep it away. Yet a small fragment of paper remained intact, caught against the stone. I stooped, retrieved it carefully. A few Latin words are still visible, though charred lucet veritas. Truth shall shine. Another echo of Lonsdale's fragment. It seemed to me then that the city itself was conspiring to leave behind these half-burned syllables, clues that survived their own destruction. Lewis found me crouched there, shook his head. He asked if I really believed scraps of paper and nervous singers could solve a death. I told him that life is built on scraps and death no less. He sighed, unwilling to argue further. We walked together out into the street where the bells began to toll the hour. Their echo rolled across the rooftops, fading only to return again. I thought of the crossword clue once more and smiled bitterly. Echo is always too short, yet it always fits. That night, the widow sent word she wished to see me. I went reluctantly, uncertain whether her silence would speak more than her words. She received me in a lodging house near Beaumont Street, her room bare, save for a vase of flowers already wilting. She did not ask me to sit. She simply began to speak. My husband, she said, believed that manuscripts contain more than words, that truth hides between the lines. He was convinced he had found something dangerous. I asked what. She said she did not know, only that he grew more secretive, more withdrawn. I asked if she had burned anything after his death. She looked at me, her eyes steady, and asked if I thought her capable of destroying his work. I told her I thought everyone was capable of destruction. She turned away then, and I noticed her hand reach once more for her ring, tracing it as she had before. An echo of gesture, returning like a refrain. I left without further words. Back in my room, whiskey in hand, I let the day settle into me, a trembling tenor, a frayed program, a burned fragment, a widow's gesture, each an echo, each perhaps a red herring. And yet even red herrings have weight. They swim in the same waters as truth. The crossword lay before me, almost complete, the word red herring anchoring its center. I studied it and thought about how fitting it was. The case, like the puzzle, seemed designed to mislead, to lure me toward false answers. And still I felt, beneath the misdirection, the faint resonance of a truth not yet spoken. I closed my eyes and heard again the choir, the unresolved harmony, the lingering note that refused to fade. An echo, perhaps, or the beginning of something more. If truth hides in Oxford, it hides most willingly in its libraries. Those rooms of dust and paper where silence is mistaken for reverence, where the air carries the faint perfume of leather binding and mildew, where generations of hands have turned pages with the same mixture of hope and futility. I have walked those corridors too often, always convinced that among the endless shelves are fragment weights that might explain everything, though usually it explains only itself. And yet the archive at Exeter gave me something I had not expected, not words, but an image. Lewis disliked it at once. Too many stairs, too many rules, too little warmth. He muttered that the Bodleian was enough for any man and that nothing in the private archive of a college would help us now. But I insisted. Lonsdale had lived in manuscripts. If he had stumbled upon a truth, it was likely preserved somewhere in the margins of another's obsession. We descended into the archive room, stone walls sweating faintly with damp, the air heavy with disuse. A single lamp flickered above the long oak table, throwing shadows that seemed almost deliberate in their placement. The librarian was a slight woman, with eyes that looked beyond you even as she answered your question. She handed us a ledger, her fingers lingering on the edge as though reluctant to let go. I asked for records of visiting scholars who had consulted the Latin holdings. She nodded once, turned to the shelves, and returned with a box of catalogued requests. The box smelled of dust and candle smoke, as if memory itself had been stored inside. Lewis sneezed, cursed under his breath, and settled into a chair. I remained standing, rifling through slips of paper with the deliberate impatience of someone who knows he is chasing fragments. Lonsdale's name appeared more than once. His requests were meticulous, covering authors I knew well and others I had forgotten. Martial, Juvenal, obscure Christian poets, even fragments of Tacitus. But there was something unusual. Each request was signed carefully, except one. A sheet torn slightly at the corner, the handwriting hurried, almost anxious. The name Adrian scrawled, the surname left incomplete, as if interrupted. I placed it aside, uncertain whether it meant anything more than haste. Yet in Oxford, haste is always suspect. Lewis, meanwhile, had grown restless. He wandered to a cabinet and opened it without ceremony. The librarian frowned but said nothing. He withdrew a folder, flipped through it, and handed it to me with a grunt. Inside lay photographs, sepia-toned, curling at the edges, college groups, dining tables, choirs arranged stiffly in their gowns. I turned the pages absently until one image stilled me. A gathering in the chapel, perhaps 10 years old, the figures caught mid-anthem, mouths open in song. And there, unmistakably, was the dean, younger, darker of hair, but with the same posture of solemnity. Beside him, a man I did not at first recognize. Then, slowly, the face resolved. It was Lonsdale, his features thinner, his eyes already distant, but him nonetheless. The caption beneath named the event as a commemoration service, listing the choir members, but not the visitors. Why was Lonsdale present in the chapel, years before he supposedly arrived as a temporary scholar? Why was his presence unrecorded, his name absent? Lewis peered over my shoulder, unimpressed. Perhaps he had attended as a guest, he suggested. Perhaps. Yet the photograph placed him here, not as a visitor, but as a participant. His lips were parted in the act of singing, his posture aligned with the choir. Not an observer, a voice within the harmony. And yet no record remained of his involvement. I asked the librarian if she recalled Lonsdale from those years. She looked at me with the same fair-off gaze, shook her head. Too many faces, she said. Too many names passing through. She replaced the folder with the same care as a priest returning the chalice to its altar. I thanked her, though thanks seemed insufficient. The photograph weighed on me. An echo of a past presence, hidden in plain sight. We left the archive, climbing the stone stairs into the lightless corridor. Lewis asked again what it proved. I told him only that it unsettled me. He muttered that everything unsettled me. Perhaps he was right. Yet I could not shake the image of Lonsdale's face, younger but already burdened, singing beside the dean. Two men whose later exchanges had been so careful, so cloaked in formality, once bound together in unacknowledged harmony. Why conceal it? Why?
Erase him from the record? A red herring, perhaps, or the first clear note of truth. That evening I sat once more with the crossword, another clue, 11 letters preserved likeness. I tried reproduction, remembrance. Neither satisfied. Then I wrote a photograph, perfect fit, a likeness, preserved and yet not always truthful. Photographs lie as easily as words, though they lie in silence. The archive had given me such a likeness of Lonsdale in harmony with the dean, but what did it preserve and what did it conceal? The puzzle offered no answer. I poured whiskey, let the burn settle. Outside the rain had returned, tapping its patient rhythm against the glass. I closed my eyes and saw again the photograph, the dean's solemnity, Lonsdale's reluctant mouth open in song, echoes, red herrings, fragments of ash, unfinished letters, trembling hands, each a piece of something larger, though the whole remained hidden. The truth was here, the anonymous letter had said, and now the archive itself had whispered agreement. I finished the whiskey, folded the crossword, and left the photograph etched in memory. Some truths do not live on the page. They live in the silence between notes, in the shadows cast by candlelight, in the forgotten faces that linger at the edges of photographs. It is there, in that silence, that I have always found Oxford most eloquent. And it was there, I feared, that Lonsdale had found his death. There are evenings when the case itself seems no closer, and yet my pencil hovers above the crossword as though it might provide what witnesses, documents, and confessions never can. Oxford thrives on contradictions, and I have learned to live with them. Stone that endures yet crumbles, men who profess honesty yet practice evasion, women who weep without tears. A crossword is at least honest in its dishonesty. It tells you outright that the clue is misleading, that only patience will make its trick yield meaning. I sometimes wonder if the whole city was built to resemble such a puzzle. I sat alone in my room, the rain having at last given way to a steady wind that rattled the sash window. On the table lay three things: the anonymous letter, the charred scrap of Latin, and the photograph from the archive. Together they formed a triad of riddles, each pointing and counterpointing like voices in a fugue. And beside them the crossword waited, its blank squares oddly comforting. I reached for the pencil as though deduction required accompaniment. One clue read 8 letters, deceit made plain. I tried falsehood, illusion, masquerade. None fit. Then the word contradiction entered my mind, though it was too long. I counted 11 letters carefully, but still the idea remained. Contradiction is deceit, but only when exposed, otherwise it passes for truth. I wrote it in the margin, letting it rest there like an impatient guest. Perhaps the case itself was nothing more than a collection of contradictions awaiting recognition. Lewis had left. Earlier, weary of my silences, he had muttered that photographs proved nothing, that ash was only ash, that tremors in a boy's hand were not indictments. I let him leave with his skepticism intact. He is right, often enough, though he is rarely patient. I prefer to sit with ambiguity, however uncomfortable. It is in discomfort that meaning flickers, brief but illuminating. I looked again at the photograph. Lonsdale beside the Dean, lips parted in song, presence unrecorded, a contradiction. The Dean had insisted Lonsdale was a recent visitor, yet here he was, years earlier, woven into the fabric of the choir. Did the Dean forget? Impossible. He forgets nothing that touches his college. Then why conceal it? Contradiction again, echoing louder each time. I poured whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light from the desk lamp. Another clue waited for 5 letters, untruth. The obvious answer was a lie. Too short to be interesting, but perhaps that was the point. Not all deception is elaborate. Sometimes it is as simple as omission, as the Dean had omitted Lonsdale's past presence. I wrote lie neatly into its place, and the grid began to close around it, the small truth locked like stone among others. The letter, he knew something, he was not alone, the truth is still here. Burn nothing, read twice. I read it a 4th time, slower. Each line contradicted the next. If he was not alone, who was with him? If the truth was still here, why urge me not to burn? If nothing was burned, why the ash by the cloister? Contradictions again, circling like ravens. Yet in contradiction there is shape, however faint. I remembered the widow's words, he feared only the truth. A curious statement. To fear the truth is to know it already or to sense its approach. Did she mean his truth or hers? Her fingers had played restlessly with her ring, a gesture she may not have noticed but which I could not forget. A sign of attachment or of loosening bonds. Contradiction in flesh. The crossword drew me back. 12 letters, double meaning. I tried equivocation. It fit perfectly. I smiled, though bitterly. Equivocation, to speak in 2 voices at once, to hide truth within the folds of ambiguity. Oxford's native tongue. The Dean had spoken it, The widow had embodied it. The tenor had trembled in it. Even Lonsdale, through his marginal notes and scattered manuscripts, seemed to speak doubly veritas lucet in tenebris, truth shining in darkness, as though light itself required shadow to be visible. I left the grid half-finished and walked to the window. The wind rattled again, and I thought of echoes, of how sound returns altered, never identical. Echo is not repetition, it is contradiction disguised as memory. The city outside was dark, lamps flickering in the gusts. A figure hurried across Beaumont Street, coat pulled tight, head bent. For a moment I thought it was the tenor, then dismissed it. Contradiction again, my eyes telling me one thing, my reason another. Later, as midnight approached, I spread the three objects again before me, the letter, the scrap, the photograph, each a contradiction. The letter instructed me not to burn what was already ash. The scrap declaring truth shines even in darkness, though truth had been hidden, obscured, destroyed. The photograph shows Lonsdale present when he should have been absent. Together they formed not clarity but counterpoint, voices against one another. And yet in counterpoint there is harmony if one listens correctly. Bird and Tallis had taught me that much. I took up the pencil once more. Another clue, 7 letters, inconsistency. I tried discord, rupture, variance. None quite right. Then I wrote irony, though it did not fit. Irony is not inconsistent, yet it dwells in the same house. Perhaps the compiler had meant a paradox. 7 letters, and it fitted neatly. Paradox, the marriage of opposites, the truth concealed in contradiction. I sat back, exhaling smoke, the taste of ash lingering on my tongue. Paradox. The scholar who sang but was absent, the widow who grieved without grief, the dean who remembered but denied, the boy who trembled yet insisted on calm. The case itself was a paradox, and I was trapped in its grid. I finished the whiskey, closed the crossword, though not before circling the words I had filled with lie, equivocation, paradox. They stared back at me like witnesses who had sworn different oaths. I felt again the weight of silence pressing in, heavier than stone, as though the city itself demanded I live inside its contradictions. And perhaps that was all a detective ever did, read twice, mishear the echo, and try to coax the truth from a grid that was never designed to be complete. There are places in Oxford where sound refuses to return. Most chapels give back what you offer them, the hymn, the cough, the shuffle of a footstep, repeating it in softened form, so that you are reminded of your own presence. But one evening, entering Exeter's chapel after the choir had gone, I discovered a silence so absolute it seemed to absorb sound rather than return it. I spoke a word aloud, and it died instantly, as though swallowed by stone. A chapel without echo. A place where voices vanish. I stood there longer than I had intended, unsettled by how easily a man might disappear in such air. Lewis had gone home early, fatigued by my insistence on returning after hours. He muttered something about the futility of haunting empty chapels. But futility is often where truth hides, and I have never trusted efficiency. I walked slowly down the central aisle, the candles extinguished, the scent of wax still faint. Stained glass in the moonlight loses all colour. The saints look down in shades of grey, their eternal patience undiminished. My footsteps fell without resonance, no echo. It was like walking in a dream where the world offers no reply. I sat in a pew, my coat still damp from the rain outside. The photograph from the archive remained, vivid in my mind, Lonsdale's face among the choir, lips parted, presence unacknowledged. I imagined him standing here, singing notes that this stone had refused to return, a contradiction embodied. To sing into silence is to confess. Perhaps that is what he had been doing all along, confessing in ways no one recognized. From where I sat, I could see the carved stalls, their edges worn smooth by centuries of hands. On one, faintly visible, a scratched word, Veritas. No one had bothered to erase it. Perhaps no one had seen it. I traced the letters with my eyes, thinking again of the charred fragment, Luceat Veritas, truth shall shine. Scratched graffiti and burned manuscripts, both shouting the same word into a chapel that swallows sound. The city seemed determined to repeat itself without repetition. I recalled the widow's gesture, her fingers endlessly circling her ring. It had seemed absent-minded, but memory reminded me of something else. In the photograph, blurred at the edge, her hand could be seen resting on Lonsdale's shoulder, though she was not listed among the choir. She had been there, present and absent, a shadow at the margin of record. Her fingers on a ring in life, her hand on his shoulder in image. Gesture repeating itself across years. I shivered. Though the chapel was not cold, I took out my notebook, though I rarely use it. I wrote down 3 words: silence, echo, absence. They looked inadequate, too bald, too obvious. I turned instead to the crossword folded in my pocket. A clue waited. 6 letters, answer withheld. I tried secret, withheld, hidden. Then the word absent struck me. 6 letters exactly, absent. The chapel had confirmed it. Absence itself was the answer. I rose, walked towards the altar. On the floor near the stalls I noticed a small object, overlooked by vergers and choirboys alike, a matchstick, damp, softened but clearly used. I picked it up, turned it in the moonlight. Why strike a match in a chapel with lamps already lit unless you burn something small, discreet? Another fragment, another contradiction. Burn nothing, the letter had said, yet here was the evidence of flame. The chapel without echo had kept its silence well. I stood for some time, listening to nothing. When you listen to silence long enough, you begin to hear your own pulse. Mine was steady, but I could not shake the sense that another pulse had once joined it here, Lonsdale's, perhaps quickened by fear. The tenor's tremor, the dean's frayed programme, the widow's circling hand, each echo had dissolved here into a void without return. I wondered whether Lonsdale had stood exactly where I stood, struck a match, and whispered words that no stone would give back. Outside, the quadrangle was deserted, the grass glistening with rain. My footsteps echoed again as soon as I passed through the gate, as though the city had been waiting to reply once I left the chapel's hold. I paused, looked back. The windows of the chapel were dark, lifeless. Yet in my mind I heard the choir still, voices rising against silence, notes dissolving without return. A chapel without echo, a death without witness. Both demanded the same patience. Back in my room, I set the used matchstick beside the other relics, the letter, the scrap, and the photograph. Together they looked absurd, too small to bear the weight of death. Yet I could not dismiss them. Each whispered a fragment. I poured whiskey, let it burn. Another crossword clue stared up at me, 9 letters without reply. I tried unanswered, ignored, forsaken. Then it came to me, echoless, hyphenated, imperfect but exact, without reply. A chapel without echo. I wrote it in, though it did not fit the grid. Some truths never do. I sat long into the night, rain resuming its steady tapping, silence pressing close. Contradictions, gestures, fragments, absences. The chapel had given me nothing, and yet its nothing was everything. To lose echo is to lose the possibility of hearing yourself return. Perhaps that was what Lonsdale had feared most, not death, but the silence that swallows song. And perhaps, in the end, that is what Oxford itself requires of those who dwell too long within its walls. There are endings that announce themselves with fanfare, with revelation, with the clatter of certainty falling into place. Oxford prefers other kinds of endings that slip past you like a shadow at dusk, so quiet you do not know they have gone until you turn and find the street empty. A quiet exit. By the time I recognized it, the case had already left me, or perhaps I had left it. The morning had begun with bells, mournful, their echoes rolling across the quadrangles like waves against stone. Lonsdale's funeral was held with all the ceremony Oxford reserves for its least familiar sons. The chapel that had refused echo now overflowed with voices chanting Latin words that masked more than they revealed. I stood near the back, as I often do, half participant, half intruder. The widow was there, her composure unbroken, her hand still tracing that invisible circle around her ring. The dean presided with his customary solemnity, his voice heavy with ritual, though I thought I saw the tremor in his hand once again when he lifted the prayer book. The choir sang with fragile precision, the trembling tenor steady now, perhaps steadied by fear of scrutiny, or perhaps grief finds its only expression in song. I should have listened to the service, but my mind wandered to the crossword folded in my pocket. I had carried it like a talisman through the days of this case, filling its squares with fragments of deduction, erasure, contradiction. The clue that pressed most insistently remained 7 letters conclusion. I had left it blank, unwilling to tempt certainty. I thought now of answers, closure, ending, resolve. None seemed honest. The truth, as always, had slipped between words. After the service, the quadrangle filled briefly with murmurs before dispersing into silence. I lingered beneath the dripping eaves, watching the procession vanish through the gate. The widow did not look back. Her exit was quiet, her silence intact. Lewis joined me, his face marked by the strain of patience. He muttered that the case would never be solved to satisfaction, that sometimes men simply die. I did not argue. He believes in the cause where I believe in the pattern. Both are unsatisfactory. We walked together through the cloister where the ash had long since been swept away. No trace remained of what had burned. The matchstick in my pocket pressed against me like a reminder. I did not show it to Lewis. Some fragments belong only to the silence that produced them. He talked of reports, of paperwork, of coroners content with natural causes. His voice echoed faintly, but I felt no echo within me. The chapel's silence had followed me out into the day. That evening, alone again, I unfolded the crossword for the final time. The grid was nearly full. Words like lie, paradox, equivocation, echoless, forming their uneasy congregation. Only the final clue remained. 7 letters, conclusion. I thought of endings that are not endings, of truths that do not shine, of voices swallowed whole by stone. Then I wrote quietly, in the small, square letters of habit silence. 7 letters exactly, the only conclusion Oxford allows. The only conclusion I could bear. I set the crossword aside, lit a cigarette, and let the smoke drift upward. Outside the rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick with reflections. I heard footsteps passing, then fading, then gone. A quiet exit again, unremarked. I thought of Lonsdale, of his half-completed manuscripts, of his marginal note declaring veritas lucet in tenebris. Truth shines in darkness. Perhaps it does, or perhaps it flickers once, then is extinguished, leaving only ash for others to misinterpret. I finished the whiskey slowly, the taste sharper than usual, as though the city itself had distilled its contradictions into the glass. On the table lay the relics, the letter twice read, the photograph, the scrap, the matchstick. I gathered them into an envelope, unlabelled, and slid it into the drawer. Oxford forgets quickly, but it never entirely forgets. The fragments would wait there,
inert, until another silence required their company. Before I went to sleep, I opened the window. The air smelled of stone washed clean, of earth darkened by rain. Somewhere a choir rehearsed, their voices faint, carried on the wind. This time the notes returned, bouncing against walls, echoing imperfectly, but echoing nonetheless. I listened until they faded, until only silence remained. A quiet exit. The city exhaled, and I was with it.